Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Harry. And Memorial Day, as you can imagine, is a somber occasion. It's a profound occasion. And as a politician, I'm not a veteran. So as someone who's in politics, you try and think, well, what can I say that's not the same thing you hear every year? And what I wanted to do this year was talk about somebody. And I want to talk about somebody who was in my generation. I was born in the 1960s, 1968, who to me represented what Memorial Day stands for, and that is service to our country. And I'm going to talk about a young man. I call him a young man because I think of him as a young man, but really he was my age, named Justin Constantine. And Justin grew up as the middle child of three in Fairfax City, which is an independent city, just like this one, with the same sort of idea of independence and strength and very close-knit community. He grew up and he went to high school with me. He actually went to grade school with me and graduated in the class in 1988. I was a couple years ahead of him, but I knew his older brother very well. We played soccer together, and I knew his whole family. And Justin went on from high school. He went to James Madison University, and he was an athlete. He was a weightlifter. He was very strong. Joined the rugby team, joined a fraternity. My friend Scott Surabel, who was there at the same time at Madison with Justin, joked that they were the only two Democrats on the fraternity row. So he was already at that time, he was like a little bit more of an open thinker, a free thinker, in addition to being a strong, a man's man. After college, he got out of college. He didn't immediately know what his career was going to be. He worked as a temp. I actually reconnected with him because we both played for the Nova Men's Rugby Club. In fact, our practice site was about a mile away at the old middle school over on Annandale Road, the old middle school site. And I just remember Justin carrying the ball and knocking tacklers over like bowling pins. He was such a great player. And while he was there, we had a conversation. He wanted to know what he was going to do with his next phase in life, and he decided to go to law school. Like a lot of folks, you don't know exactly what you're going to do. You decide to go to grad school. And while he was in grad school, he was back one summer, and he told me he was going to join the United States Marine Corps and become a JAG officer. And we had a conversation about that. It seemed like a good fit for him. He was a very active type. He was a patriotic type. His brother had been in the Air Force. And so Justin went through officer candidate school. He went through the basic school. He got commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1996. And he served for 6 years on active duty. He was a JAG officer representing both defendants and the prosecution in prosecuting cases, and essentially working as an attorney within the U.S. Marine Corps justice system. He left active duty after 6 years and he stayed in the reserves. And then in 2006, when the Iraq War was at its apex, he volunteered to go back into the service and serve as a civil affairs officer in Iraq. And he was assigned to what was known as, it was the Anbar province, it was known as the Sunni Triangle. It was the most dangerous area in Iraq. And he was actually given what was considered a rear duty billet as a civil affairs officer, but there was no rear duty in Anbar province. And the idea of his service was to basically build a government infrastructure. America had come in and they had taken over Saddam Hussein's regime and to effectively build democratic structures within Iraqi society so that society could, if not become America, at least have a democratic platform where they could thrive. On October 18, 2006, Justin was on patrol in Anbar when he was shot by a sniper. And the bullet went through the back behind his ear, went through the back of his head, and came out through his mouth. And in probably any other conflict in human history would have been fatal. But Justin's life was saved by a Navy corpsman named George Shaw, who performed an emergency tracheotomy on the site, was able to reopen his windpipe. He was taken, obviously, to a field hospital immediately, and then was flown to medevac to the Army Field Hospital in Germany. And over the next month, they had 20 surgeries to put his face back together. And I remember him telling me that there was a mirror in his room, and they hung towels over the mirror so he could not see what his face looked like. It had literally been destroyed. Well, that's the first part of Justin's life. Let me talk about the second part, because that's the part I really want to focus on. Justin came back stateside at the end of 2006, and he had suffered extraordinary wounds, and those of us that had played rugby together or were in the Fairfax High School alumni community, we all knew about this, and we were all emailing and GoFundMe and all the usual responses. And I Justin's house was not far from mine. I drove down the street and knocked on his door, and we visited for about an hour. And obviously, his face, you could tell that there had been a catastrophic injury. But the thing that I remember was his spirit was unchanged. He was talking about the future. He was talking about what he wanted to do. He was talking about becoming a lawyer again. He was talking about service and the people he had served with. And he also was talking about somebody else, and her name was Dalia Hamza. And she was a very beautiful young woman who had been a student that he had met on a Spanish language study program down in Argentina. How many Marines are in a Spanish language study program in Argentina before they go off on active duty? But that was Justin. He was this Renaissance man. And he was excited about his relationship with Dalia. And the ironic thing was, it didn't end with his injury. It actually got stronger. And she spoke at his funeral and talked about they had just met for like a week. But when she heard about the injury, rather than sort of writing this guy off, she went to go visit him. And in order to get into the hospital, she had to make up a falsehood, which that she was his fiance, but they only dated for a week. But she managed to talk her way in there, and their relationship blossomed. Justin recovered, and he re-entered society. He resumed his legal career. I used to see him at Fairfax County Courthouse when I was trying cases. He re-entered the Marine Corps as an active duty officer, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He was not able to play rugby again because of the injuries, but he became an avid weightlifter. I remember one election cycle, I was standing outside of Dunmore Metro shaking hands, and Justin walked up, and he shook my hand and almost broke it in two. And so for someone who was, quote, disabled, I never met a man that strong. He married Dalia in 2008, and those of us, the rugby guys, we had a bachelor party for him, and no, it wasn't as crazy as you think it might be. But I remembered how normal he was, and just talking about the future and his excitement about being married and the places they were going to travel. He never asked for special treatment. He was always just one of the guys, and I mean that in sort of the colloquial sense. Justin retired from the United States Marine Corps in 2013. He became a full-time advocate at that point for wounded warriors. He was a special counsel with the Department of Justice. He served on the U.S. Senate Committee on Veteran Affairs. He was recognized by President Obama for his service on behalf of veterans. And he continued a life of service in that way. And one of the things I remember from his funeral was when Justin was at the VA hospital with these terrible disfiguring wounds, rather than stay in his own room and sort of shut himself off from society, he would actually go visit some of the enlisted men who were younger than him, just to encourage them, to motivate them to recover from their injuries, which were almost in all cases less severe. And to just be a leader, be an officer, because he thought of himself as an officer. He then eventually became a motivational speaker. He moved to New York, where Dalia was pursuing a PhD, and then was in Cambridge, England, and effectively followed his wife while he himself pursued his career as a motivational speaker. The sad part was Justin contracted cancer in 2020, and I don't know if it was related to his wartime injuries. I don't know the causation, but the bottom line was he passed last summer. He will be buried at Arlington Cemetery, and I attended his funeral last fall, and there were hundreds of people there, both from the Marine Corps and people that had grown up together with Justin and wanted to celebrate his life because we considered him a hero. There's two significant memories of Justin that I think back to which relate to Memorial Day. The first one was in February of 2007, he received his Purple Heart, and he chose to do it at the United States Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, which is a wonderful museum, and I commend all of you to visit it. And I just remember the long line of cars where those of us coming down from Fairfax City, traveling down 123 and down to 95 to support Justin, because he was our community. I mean, he literally, I could see him yesterday just as a freshman in high school. He was one of ours. And then the second thing I remember about Justin was his total lack of bitterness about what had happened to him. You know, so many things happen to us negative in life, and we hold a grudge against the person that committed that act. And yet Justin was the exact opposite. In fact, we had a mutual friend from high school who was in a movie produced and shown on HBO about growing up Islamic, growing up Muslim in America. And Justin showed up, and he actually spoke at the premiere of this movie and encouraged everyone to see it. He gave the opening remarks. He never mentioned the fact that he had been the recipient of a wound in that context. Instead, he encouraged people to come together. He never, at any point, drew any negative remarks about the person that shot him. He just said he was doing his job, I was doing mine. The bottom line is he was always there for a friend. He never showed any bitterness. In that way, he was very Lincolnian in the way that he conducted himself. So my closing. We think of his Memorial Day oftentimes as a way of celebrating wars that are long gone by. Maybe it's the Civil War, World War II, maybe Vietnam. We don't associate it so much with modern conflicts. But the wounds that people received in those conflicts are just as severe. The deaths are just as profound. Justin Constantine never thought of himself as a hero, but in many ways he was the prototypical 21st century American hero. Someone who was tolerant, someone who was courageous, someone who was strong, someone who was masculine, someone who was not afraid, and yet at the same time never held a grudge, was never bitter against anybody. I asked his wife Dahlia, who is here today, to attend, and she took the time to be here. Dahlia, could you please stand up? And I mentioned Dahlia because for every wounded warrior, for every Gold Star family, there's typically someone behind that family. There's someone behind that story, someone who held that hand, someone who was the family behind that hero. And Dahlia has been that person. And I know Justin's parents, Rudy and Judy Constantine, couldn't be here. They still live in Fairfax City. And I also would recognize them. So, I'll leave you just with a couple thoughts. I'm one of those people, I believe very strongly in two things. One, that America is a positive force for good in the world. I believe that. And secondly, the people that died in the service of America did not die in vain. Their death, their lives made an impact. They made a difference. And again, I just leave you with commending Justin Constantine, someone who was an American hero, someone who lived and died on behalf of his country and with his family that supported him. I just ask you to remember families like that this Memorial Day. Thank you for permitting me to speak. God bless.